Up and
We're
running.
running.
Okay, we got to start, folks, because
As you always say, we have to start.
if we don't start, we won't be able to stop.
Okay, sweethearts, we're starting.
Oh, all right, start.
We're on page 50.
We're on 51, I believe. This is, we're coming to the end of ethics. And
Say that again.
Come to the end of ethics?
we're on page 51. We're coming to the end of the course. And if you've looked through the notes, you'll notice that they're a little bit random in terms of the topics. The systemization is breaking down. So please bear with me. I just want to make sure we at least say something about what's on the pages. And then, of course, we have this amazing chart on page 54 to look at. And when we're done with this, the plan would be to begin metaphysics subsequently, if I can remember what that's all about. So let's go to page 51 and see what we can do. The distinction at the top is a very important one. The judgment of ethics regarding punishment, as we were beginning to talk about things like capital punishment, belongs to philosophers, not to political scientists, criminal justice specialists, sociologists. You wouldn't think it. I mean, if you hear the discussion that occurs in the national media, every time they bring in an expert, it's going to be a sociologist or a political scientist. And we sometimes forget that the question of whether we ought to execute somebody is a normative question. It's the difference between simply describing something and making a normative judgment about it. The social sciences, which include political science, criminal justice, and sociology, are descriptive sciences. It is based on what's called the is-ought dichotomy. Some philosophers, in fact, so render the is-ought dichotomy that they conclude that you can't make a normative judgment because they don't see how you can go from the way something is in order to determine how it ought to be. I'm not really trying to make that argument right now, but it is noteworthy that a judgment of whether one ought to have something like capital punishment is a normative judgment. It is not something based on the descriptive sciences. It's just like political scientists can tell you how the systems of, say, the political parties work, but they can't tell you which political system you ought to have in terms of what is appropriate to human nature, human rights and obligations. That's a normative judgment, and it belongs to moral philosophy. So you can get all the political scientists you want in the world, and they can't tell you how things ought to be. But that doesn't stop them from doing it, because in practice what happens is these specialists go outside their field. You know, when a political scientist tells you what system of government you ought to have, he's rendering a moral judgment. If he tells you that you ought to or ought not to have capital punishment, that's a moral judgment. What he can tell you, perhaps, is whether capital punishment has a deterrent effect upon others, all right? That's a legitimate judgment. It may be based on some kind of sociological observations. That's appropriate to a descriptive science. But look, it's the same thing, say, with chemistry. I could tell you as a chemist how to make arsenic, but you know what the next line is. That doesn't tell you whether you should give it to someone. The judgment of whether you should give it to someone, that's a normative judgment. That belongs to ethics, but it belongs to the chemist to tell you how to make the poison, and properly so. So how do you go from the is to the ought? I wasn't going to talk about that, but I raised the issue, so I guess I have to. Basically, the movement from the is to the ought arises because of an understanding of the objective nature of man. If you're not able to form a judgment about the objective nature of man, you can't determine what he ought to be and what he ought to do. The correlation of the ought arises from the finality of human nature, which is ordered to seeking the good, ultimately the ultimate good, which is God. And what we can say is that if a human being fails to attain the end of its nature, then it is not a good human being. Just like a horse that can't run, we send him to the glue factory because he's not a good horse. So we can say that a good horse ought to be able to trot and gallop. So too, a good man ought to exercise virtue and ought to seek God as his last end. So by understanding how things exist, we can determine what constitutes a good instance of that sort of thing, and therefore, in the case of human action, we can describe what we ought to do because of an understanding of our nature and its finality. But given the fact that many philosophers have no grasp of human nature, understandably, they don't see how you go from the is to the ought. If you think that man is nothing but a pile of atoms, having no purpose and no source in God, then obviously you're not going to see any oughtness to his nature or to his actions in relation to that nature, because you don't even know that he's got a nature. Coming back to the question of capital punishment, point F on page 51 says that the principles of totality or integrity, subsidiarity, and double effect justify capital punishment. Now, how on earth do these come into play? The notion of totality refers to the relationship between the individual and society. And just as sometimes it's necessary to amputate a hand to save the entire human being, so too it is sometimes necessary to completely remove an offender from society for the sake of society as a whole. Now, clearly you can't do that to an innocent person, but when a person has, we say, forfeited his right to life by committing an egregious criminal act, then the principle of subsidiarity says that it is licit to remove him from society by an application of the principle of double effect. Double effect tells us that we don't will the death of the person for the sake of killing him, but for the sake of reestablishing peace and order and retributive justice, that balance of justice within society, and also to protect society from his further actions. I realize people always say, well, put them away for life, they're not going to come back, you don't have to worry about it, but as we've mentioned before, they still have an interaction with society. One thinks of Charles Manson actually putting one of his girls up to another act of murder, even though he was purportedly put away forever. Plus the fact, of course, that he interacts with his jailers and society has to pay to keep him alive. So you're not completely gone until you're completely gone. Yes.
And he still has appeals,
Yeah.
appeals, but what's the?
He comes up for possible probation.
Probation, yeah, which is scary.
I have a question of how subsidiarity fits into this. If we understand subsidiarity is what can be done by the lower, shouldn't be done by the higher, how does that work in capital punishment?
I was wondering myself that this week. The one way I can see it would apply is that there are some powers that belong to the nation as a whole that don't belong to you or me as individuals. I cannot determine that you have committed a capital offense and therefore decapitate you. But society as a whole can render such a judgment that requires execution. So that would be an instance in which the lower unit, namely the individual, cannot act on his own behalf but rather this is an action that only can be taken by society as a whole. Now, of course, how big a society? I mean, you can't get together with Fred and decide to kill Tom. This has to be a little bit more organized than that. No, it's nothing personal, Tom. And you're lucky Fred isn't here tonight anyway. All right, so just to go through the notes, the part, for example, the murderer, is an active threat to society and may therefore be removed. That would be the relationship of the part to the whole. But we must, of course, remember that deterrence, which is not an essential part of the act of punishment, still is a legitimate side effect of the act of punishment. And one other factor, which we maybe haven't mentioned before, and that is that justice, if this is to be properly applied, needs to be fairly swift and consistent. We have instances of people being on death row for 20 years. That's just not fair. And of course, if they've been there 20 years, they get religion and they've been rehabilitated, and they've had 20 years to practice this. And at that point, you feel very, heartfelt for them because they're so removed from the act that they committed so long ago. But that somewhat amounts to simply doing away with capital punishment. Because by the time you're done, you say, well, we'll parole them after all. Point number 3, which raises an interesting question. Some people say, well, what if we make a mistake? What if we kill the wrong person? What if we execute the wrong person? He can't come back. It's an irreversible error. Now, this may sound a little bit hard-hearted, but that is not a sufficient reason to do away with capital punishment. I think this is found in the Summa Contra Gentiles, Book 3, Chapter 140. I'm not sure about 146 because it's got a question mark next to it and I don't remember offhand. You notice it says there, if you do away with capital punishment because of the possibility of a mistake, what you're doing is ignoring the good of the whole for the sake of one individual. And you might say, but he was innocent. How could you do such a thing? All right, well, what are you going to do? Okay, so we won't execute him. We'll just put him in jail for the rest of his life without parole. Maybe solitary confinement. Well, good Lord, he could still be innocent. And there are innocent people in jail right now. And permanently so. I mean, you think this is that much less of a penalty? I realize they say, well, we developed DNA recently, so now we're finding all these people that shouldn't have been there, and we're retrieving them. But we forget that any penalty is still a very severe penalty. So if you're going to administer capital punishment, it ought to be done swiftly, justly, and consistently. Now, of course, that is precisely why you don't want to do it in a case that's doubtful. And of course, as you know, the church, the last couple popes, have tried to argue or have taught that we virtually should not have capital punishment. I believe that it was Cardinal Dulles who said that his understanding was that what the Holy Father really meant is that it should be extremely rare. And of course, the problem is that one of the arguments against it is that in the society which we have today, we can take care of people. You don't have to keep them. You don't have to kill them to keep them totally harmless to society. But the problem is that not every society has a system of justice and prisons as we do in this country. What do you do in some of these Islamic countries to handle radical terrorists? You know, what are you supposed to do? Put them all in jail? And then you get into the problem of sometimes they'll if you're holding somebody who's committed a terrible crime, they'll take 100 hostages and say release him, or we'll kill the 100 hostages, or we won't release them. So in a sense, the only way to take them off the table completely so they can't be bartered with is if you execute them.
Why do you say that deterrence is not essential but true? What does that mean?
Well, it means that if somebody commits a crime and you punish them severely, but justly, proportionate to the crime, it will deter others, and that's good. But you can't punish them just in order to deter. You can't add an extra year to their sentence just to deter others, because that would be unjust to them. So deterrence is a side effect of punishment, but it cannot be the sole reason for a punishment. It cannot be the sole reason for making it a more severe punishment. The punishment must fit the crime, period. Side effect of that is you may also deter others. Side effect of that may be that you rehabilitate the person. But rehabilitation is not the purpose of punishment. Retributive justice is. You're seeking to restore to the society the balance that is required in order for laws to be observed and respected. Remember, you always got to take this back to the starting point. Why do we have punishment at all? When you pass a law, why do you have laws? Where you have society, you need order. Where you need order, you need some laws. You have to have laws to where you can park your car. You can't park your car in the middle of my front yard, okay? And I ought to have the police on my side. I should not have to take a shotgun out and point it at you to get your car off my lawn, okay? So that's why we have laws. We're so used to bridling against laws because they're so excessive and so innumerable that we sometimes forget we do need them. And if you're going to have a law, you have to have some kind of sanction so that people have a reason to obey the law. Sanctions, remember, of two kinds. You can give people a reward for obeying the law, but more frequently we give them a fine or imprisonment or some kind of punishment for violating the law. And then, of course, you get into the old analysis that the punishment must fit the crime. If I behead you, you will never park on my lawn again. But that seems a bit excessive. And conversely, if you're running around beheading people, I can't punish you by saying you're not allowed to park on my lawn. So there has to be proportion and a balance. And the more egregious the crime, the more severe the punishment. Ultimately, life in prison, and even when we have life in prison and without parole, there is the one step further. What happens when somebody commits an even greater crime? Good grief! You just saw in the papers in the last week about that man in, was it Norway?
Yeah.
Who systematically killed 77 people. And what did he get for punishment? 20 years in jail. 20 years in jail. He'll only be something like 50 years old, and he's out again. Now that is not a punishment that fits the crime. It boggles the imagination, but it shows you where a very liberal kind of judicial system ultimately crashes upon the shoals of insanity. That's why you can't do that. There has to be a due proportion, and every now and then, even when you're in a state like New York where we don't have capital punishment, every now and then somebody does something so unbelievably horrible that you wake up in the morning and say, oh, good grief. You know, even people that were against capital punishment say, gee, we should have had it for this guy, but it's not on the books. Just because it's on the books doesn't mean you have to administer it. But having it on the books gives you the option to administer it if you have to. Next point here, self-defense need not be based on the simultaneousness of the defense. In other words, you can anticipate or preempt an attack both individually and in a just war. We talked about this before, but if I've got a shotgun and I'm aiming it at you, you don't have to really wait till I pull the trigger before you start to defend yourself.
Could you use that argument against our attack on Iraq? Because that's the argument they used, it was a preemptive war.
Here's the problem, and it's a matter of judgment. It's a matter of prudential judgment as to when you have circumstances that warrant this kind of analysis. I'm wondering, I'm trying to be a little bit careful here because I realize that the Holy See condemned preemptive war as such, but I think it becomes a matter of how you define the preemption. I mean, if you want to know where we have a case of possible preemption, I wouldn't refer to Iraq, I would talk about Iran. Because as you probably know, the Canadians just broke diplomatic relations with Iran today and brought all the diplomatic people home. This is not a good sign. My suspicion is they know something you and I don't know. But the issue for the country of Israel is, what do you do with a country that has publicly announced it's going to annihilate you when it gets the chance, and it's in the process of building an atomic bomb, and you live in a very tiny country? When does this get analogous to somebody pointing a shotgun at your head and putting their finger on the trigger, especially when they say we're about to pull it? Now, I'm glad I don't have to make the Israelis' decision, but I suspect the Canadians know something that you and I don't know. I hope that isn't the case, but when you start recalling your entire embassy, it gets a little bit nerve-wracking. Not a good time to go take a vacation there. Yes.
I know in our legal system they have victim impact statements.
Yes.
Should the judgment of society be more harsh or more lenient depending on the degree of forgiveness or resentment of the victim, or is it?
I don't think that's it. I think that the impact statement legitimately allows the judge, or whoever's making the decision of the punishment, to more fully understand the seriousness of the crime. Now, the fact that you say, I was horribly impacted, does not mean that the judge has to believe you. But you may say you're horribly impacted and explain how you're horribly impacted, and in the process, the degree of malice in the crime may become more evident to the judge. So, it's one of those things where, yes, it makes a difference, and no, it doesn't make a difference, depending upon which aspect of it you look at. It's like the problem with hate crimes. If I kill you or hit you in the nose because I hate you, it doesn't really make much difference whether I hated you or not. Your nose still gets crushed, and I ought to be punished for crushing your nose. But my motivation in doing it really is largely irrelevant, excepting as an extenuating circumstance. You might have said something really bad to me, which caused me to lose my temper and do it. That may be relevant, but see, that entails your actual action, whereas the concept of a hate crime is just because you are who you are and I don't like those kind of people, this motivates me to this action, and therefore it makes the crime worse. I frankly reject that because, among other things, you've got to start reading people's minds, and that's not to be the case. I think there's a old song that some of you may remember called Standing on the Corner, and there's a line in it about you can't go to jail for what you're thinking. Well, it appears today you can. So, but I mean, that's only, 60 years ago. And they so easily said that and nobody doubted it. But it has changed. And that's part of the subjectivism of our age. And relativism. We've gone from the objective order to the subjective order. We've gone from just what was done to asking, well, why'd you do it? And not for the purpose of exculpating you because you were mentally deranged, but by reason of trying to find something nastier about your motivation.
Yeah, I'd like to bring up with that, this new law that was passed, the NDAA, because that's basically what the government's doing. They're reading your mind to see if, like, you're pro-life or something like that, and you're on a terrorist list, and they come and pick you up according to this law, you know.
And it becomes very subjective as to what constitutes a terrorist.
Terrorist, yeah, that's it, yeah.
Yeah, I know. I think somebody was saying if you stock food for more than 30 days, more than a week, that's enough to make them suspicious that you're some kind of terrorist.
Let's make, for example, this preemptive war. If Iran now shoots at Israel because it's going to say, I feel threatened by you, how are they going to be justified? Since you got hundreds of nuclear weapons pointing at me and other nations.
That's right, but Israel's had them for a long time. They haven't attacked Iran.
Did Iran attack Israel?
No, but Iran has said they want to exterminate Israel.
How do we know that?
Pardon me?
They've said it.
They've said
Did you
it.
hear them saying
Ahmadinejad has said it.
Yeah, he's
it? Or
said it.
Yeah.
did you hear
And
CNN
they've got
A lot of them.
they have a theological rationale for doing it. Yeah, I mean, it really needs to be done according to their understanding. And
there is a twisting of words. I don't want to argue
No, that's okay.
class, but there was a twisting of words. They used this speech of the president of Iran saying that Israel doesn't have rights to exist there because they never been there till 1948, that they were created artificially through some United Nations.
and what would one infer from that?
Pardon me?
What would one infer from that line of reasoning?
Doesn't mean that he's going to eliminate them or get rid of them. They don't have power. They don't even have one nuclear weapon compared to thousands of
Well,
people.
don't forget, it's very easy for Iran to defuse the situation, and that is to let inspectors come in and assure that they're not going to make a bomb.
But
That's
they
all.
did let them.
But so
They-
far,
Well-
Israel has a very bad record of
Okay,
attacking
let's not get into the details of a particular conflict.
but
Always
the
remember,
rights of
yeah.
one nation to the rights of other nation.
But you have to remember that we're trying to get the abstract principle here. And if de facto the description I gave you of Iran versus Israel is incorrect, then the application of the principle that I laid down is incorrect. And you're free to go out and judge something different. In fact, that is precisely the problem or the rationale one has to remember in terms of magisterial statements of the Catholic Church pertaining to matters of faith and morals. They're always general. The application in terms of, say, applying social justice principles to the body politic is a matter of prudential judgment. And good men can have differing views as to how it is to be done. This doesn't apply to something like abortion, though, because abortion can never be justified because it's evil in itself. But when you're talking about the application of principles pertaining to acts that are not evil in themselves, but can be good under certain contexts, then you can have a disagreement between good people on both sides. It's sort of like when they go to war and both sides are saying, Gott mit uns, God's with us. Both sides are saying it in World War I. And in most cases, to the average soldier, that's how they view it. But we do have to distinguish between things that are intrinsically evil, which are condemned by the church, for example. Under no circumstances, it's not a matter of prudential judgment. You can never allow that an act of abortion is licit under any circumstance. But you could have a disagreement about the application, say, of social justice principles to unionization. Sister?
There's, on the world over, there was an interview with, I don't know if the man's name was Shank or what. He's a Democrat, pro-Obama. And his argument is that he is pro-life. However, because the programs that Obama is suggesting are to get rid of poverty and, to put people on the well road and so forth, that will affect abortion and limit abortion. Is that a legitimate argument for saying I'm pro?
It's not a legitimate argument for endorsing a candidate who explicitly, positively, and directly sanctions abortion.
So this gentleman who claims to be a Catholic, a Democrat, pro-Obama, or I hate to make the name, but pro that stance, says because poverty would be eliminated, it would reduce the number of abortions. Therefore, he would feel it would be legitimate to vote for the Democratic Party.
But there's a difference between things that you estimate are going to happen beyond your control as opposed to actively endorsing a policy that will commit the act that is prohibited.
So he's not legitimate.
Well, yeah, it's also utilitarianism.
It's convoluted reasoning.
But the point is, if you've got somebody who's directly going out and engaged in advocating policies and laws that will directly permit abortions, that's quite different than trying to calculate with a crystal ball as to what policies are liable to increase or decrease them. That's beyond the kin of what you can control, but you sure can control the guy that you're putting in office who's going to do them.
So would that be a bad means to a perceived good end anyway?
No, because it's not bad to take care of people that are hungry.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. In other words,
Abortion.
yeah, but what I think she's saying is that
No, he's not supporting abortion.
the overall policies are more beneficial to society, and one of the side effects of their beneficial is that it will decrease abortions. But the problem is that you're endorsing somebody who is actively going to legislate the permission of the act. Now, the truth is, in our present political context, both parties are permitting the act. It's just a question of how much.
Yeah.
And you are permitted to choose, you don't want to say the lesser of two evils, but the more restrictive laws are, you can support the candidate who would more likely or in fewer cases permit abortion, as opposed to the one who would wantonly permit abortion.
So this gentleman, technically,
He's a liar.
he's wrong.
Yes, he's wrong.
Okay.
I have a friend, David Carlin, that I went to graduate school at Notre Dame with, who wrote a book entitled, Can a Catholic Be a Democrat? He wrote the book. I mean, you can get it on Amazon, which is kind of interesting because he's a Democrat. In fact, he was the majority leader of the Rhode Island State Senate for some time. And I asked him, well, given that you wrote this book, how can you vote for Democrats? He says, well, I'm living in Rhode Island. Everybody's a Democrat. So it's a matter of choosing between Democrats. It's not a question of Republicans don't get elected.
But nobody speaks to this, and women religious are thinking, I think, the same way that this gentleman is.
Oh, yes, it's a very common way of thinking. We're going to do more good in general, and that's why somebody's got to come out and say, look, you cannot, and this isn't a question of religious belief, this is moral philosophy. You can't directly permit, we use the word sanction, a law that's going to permit abortion, to take human life. You can't directly do it. If you've got two legislators, though, one's going to permit more than the other, you can vote for the one who would be more restrictive. But you can't say, well, I'm going to vote for the one that's going to legalize the act and then hope that he will create conditions that are so nice that people won't perform the act. That's not terribly realistic.
Right, and it's not actual either, because they would have no determination when you start out by saying, if I do that, that will be a certainty.
The clear principle is that you cannot directly will evil. And to enact legislation that does not protect the innocent is a direct evil.
see, that's what the argument always is, that the poor are the poor innocent.
Yes, but when you say does not protect the innocent, what I mean is it sanctions, it permits acts that will actually be murder in their content, and that you can't ever will. That is a direct commission of the act, as opposed to what you allow others to do. You may not be able to stop them from doing these things. If these people really want to lower the number of abortions, then they should back the legal position that says they're illegal. That's how you stop them, if you really want to stop them. Dennis?
It never ceases to amaze me that as the whole world sort of becomes more insane about everything since 1973, and you've got the APA, which is the Psychological Association, saying, well, we've done studies, this doesn't harm people. And if you look right at those studies that they have, they say, well, we didn't compare people that had abortions with people that didn't have abortions. That would be mixing apples with oranges. Because right at the start of the paper, we only looked at people with abortions and said, well, we didn't find a difference between these people and these people. What does that tell you? Nothing. You know?
Well, this is the problem with studies. All right, let's keep going through these so we can finish the course. G, authority proceeds from God through man to society as a basis for society. So that in an act of self-defense, remember, you can't act on your own to decide who you're going to execute, but in an act of self-defense, one man participates in the authority of civil society. So, I mean, what it comes to is if you can't call the police because somebody's about to kill you, you have the right to kill them if need be to defend yourself, because it is impossible to wait for society as a whole to act. But in so doing, you are acting on behalf of society in a context in which it is understood that you can do this. And that, in fact, is why we have laws that specify when and how self-defense is permissible. I'm not saying I agree with all the laws that are on the books, but that's why there are laws that will say, yes, you can do it in some instances. In some states, they'll say if somebody's breaking into your house, you can shoot them. In other states, they'll say you can't. I'm not saying they're equally good laws, but that's why we have laws that describe when self-defense is legitimate and when it isn't. Analogously, H, regarding war, here we have an analogy to the individual within the society. We have the international common good. And we're talking about relations between sovereign states. Remember, this is a little trickier. The international common goods are just the same as they are for the individual nation. Things like peace, order, civic friendship, justice. And it's because these common goods are sometimes denied that there is such a thing as a right of intervention by one state in the affairs of another state in order to restore and to protect the common good. Now, again, you could get into an argument as to, is this a licit place for intervention? But consider what happened between, Rwanda and Burundi some 20 years ago, where there was like 6 million people killed, and the Society of Nations just stood by and let it happen. You have an obligation to protect human life in such an egregious injustice. And it could easily have been done because neither one of those countries was powerful at all. But we just let it happen. And that becomes as immoral as failing to help your neighbor when he's being attacked by a third party. If you can do it without getting yourself killed, you have an obligation to help your neighbor. We talked about this before, and I don't want to go back into it too much, but the question arises, is the just war theory outmoded by nuclear war because of a lack of due proportion? In other words, does it mean that the moment people are going to use nuclear weapons, or somebody's got them, you can't have war? You just got to stop. Of course, this is sort of like pacifism. You know, you could be a pacifist if you want, but the only place that you can have pacifists is in societies that are not pacifist. Because if you have a society that's completely pacifist, what happens to it? It's going to get invaded. It's going to get taken over by a non-pacific society. So, by like token, if you come to the conclusion that there's no such thing as a just war and you never can defend yourself, what you're really saying is that if you have a government that has nuclear weapons, it can simply run rampant over anybody it wants to. And nobody has a right of self-defense even if they have nuclear weapons. The point that one has to bear in mind, and this is an added feature we often don't think of, is that death is not the worst evil. There are worse evils than death, such as subjecting your people to a social situation which would destroy their immortal end. And that's why Cardinal Manzenti, when he was right here at Niagara University some years back, pointed out that communism sends men to hell. This is not the same thing as just trying to argue between two societies as to which is going to maintain property rights or who's going to be governing. When you deal with the question of someone who is taking away your very right to your immortal destiny, it's more important than simply the state of your physical life. All right, let's go over to page 52. As you see, we're coming here to the end, but I don't think we're going to quite make it. Notice we have the division here between general ethics and special ethics. And now we can kind of look back at where we've come over the last, has it been about a year? In this
42 classes.
42 classes, so that's got to be about a year because we took some classes off. But you notice, you started with general ethics. You start by examining the conditions of human nature and the conditions which determine the morality of an act. And obviously, we're not going to go through all of it, and some of it's going to be reprised 2 pages from here. So I'm not going to do it all right here. But reason reflects on human nature. And by examining human nature, we come to the understanding of the natural moral law, which is human nature as to its oughts, how it ought to be, expressed as a rule that we understand as objective morality. In other words, because we have an objective nature, an objective human nature created by God, we have an obligation to live according to that nature. If we live according to that nature, that enables us to understand an objective code of moral law as to what things are appropriate to that nature and what things are offensive to that nature. By reason, we apply these laws in the concrete according to the virtue of prudence, and by understanding the nature of law, we form conscience, which tells us what things are right or wrong in accordance with natural law. If we practice prudential good acts, we develop virtue, which would be to habitually act in a proper way. And when a human being develops hopefully all the virtues in a sufficient form, they are ordered then towards their last end, which is happiness for the individual, ultimately in the next life by the attainment of God, the supreme good, in himself. How exactly that is attained, that's of course something we don't fully understand in this life, but we can understand that our nature is such that it seeks and aims towards the greater and greater good, and that God is the supreme good, which cannot be attained as long as we are in this life. So we have an obligation, and then prudence applies to the here and now, which leads us to subjective morality, which has to do with what conditions affect our exercise or attainment of objective morality. And this is what I want to get at for a moment. We live in a world of great relativism, where people say, well, you can't know what's right or wrong, everything is just kind of fudgy. And therefore, when you start a course in ethics, to study ethics, the first thing you have to do is establish there are some things that are right and wrong. There's an objective system of morality. So we spend much of ethics trying to explain to people and convince people that there are some things that by their nature are simply wrong. You can't ever do them. And we're trying to get them away from the idea, the Pinocchio principle of what is right is what my conscience tells me. Everything's subjective. It's just what I feel is right. So we spend a lot of time in an ethics course trying to get people to be aware that there's an objective set of laws and rules that we ought to live up to based upon the objective content of human nature. And just when you get done doing that and you've explained to them about all the kinds of acts that are wrong and why they're wrong, you turn around and go into the subjective part of ethics, which tells us, well, wait a minute though, although these things are objectively wrong, you got to realize that we as human beings operate with certain limitations on our freedom, so that we're not always fully responsible for everything we do. And by the time you're done, you've come back to the subjective end of things, and you're talking about conscience and all the things that could affect your judgment and your freedom and how passion interacts with the judgment, so that what objectively might be a very terrible act for somebody to commit, they might have little or no objective responsibility for it. So you've come full circle. And you might almost say, but then aren't we right where we started? Aren't we right back where anything goes? It's just what you feel like. Well, that's why we spent so much time at the beginning establishing that there's an objective order. Because, yes, the subjective rules of conscience do apply and may diminish responsibility, but our obligation as human beings is, to the best of our ability, to make our behavior conform to the objective norms. If we fail for reasons beyond our control, okay, we may know and God will know that we're not fully responsible, but that doesn't allow us the benefits of excusing our behavior by saying, well, it's only human. People often say, okay, so I was human. That's how we explain what we did that was horrible. So it's a balance that has to be maintained, but always with an understanding that there is an objective template. There is an objective order of right and wrong, and that's what human nature is called to. Now let's look at B here. These are all over the place. I don't even know where to go with that one. That's obviously talking about procreation and marriage and children and how male and female exercise the powers of procreation, and that there should be no impediments to this exercise of the powers. That would not be moral to deliberately prevent the end, which would be the child. So what it's really talking about is contraception. It's talking about the misuse of the sexual powers, which are properly ordered to new life and should always be open to life, or not be exercised at all. And then under C, you can see where we went here. This is completely different. The elements of society as ordered to the higher good. This refers to that chart. That chart, you may remember a number of pages back, which was analogous to the various powers within human nature. So that the body economic, which would be down at the lowest level of the nutritive powers of man, aims at allowing us the leisure, and the health, or the body recreative aims at good health, mental health, and so forth. The body political aims at producing peace and order in society, so that at its highest level we can have culture in society, which is the contemplation of beauty in nature and in the mind and in the world. So ultimately all of the efforts of society is aimed at not merely producing mere sustenance of human life. I mean, sometimes you think that's what Marxism is talking about. Just, we'll just barely keep the masses alive. No, this is aimed at producing the higher powers of human society so that man can enjoy the contemplation of things like music and art and poetry and the study of history and the study of the various sciences, and above all, the study of moral science and that which would be appropriate to man's last end. Obviously, with room there even for religious revelation, whereby God gives us a great boost towards the understanding of things that otherwise we would not be so good at grasping. And then under number 27, we have special ethics, which is considered from relationship to the end. Notice general ethics, you're looking at human nature. Special ethics, you're looking at the end of man, and within special ethics, that's where we get into discussing specific rights or wrongs, goods or bads, as it were. In individual ethics, we seek the end of man by means of developing the intellectual and moral virtues. Domestic ethics, we're talking about the nature of marriage, the relationship between male and female, and how marriage is a natural institution of society. It's the basis of society, and that, of course, is why every dictatorship, from the Nazis to the communists, absolutely want to annihilate the family. The family is the natural building block of society, and if you can destroy the family, you can destroy society. And of course, as you know, that's what we've done today. We have virtually destroyed the family. We've come up with something called a blended family, which sounds as like a milkshake.
So where that
You don't know who's related to who.
Where this put us under Nazis or under communists? What's there for us?
We're secular humanists. Yeah.
Maybe both.
I think of a woman I once knew who was trying to introduce her third husband's son, and she introduced him as her stepson-in-law. Don't try to figure it out. But it's what you come to when you get into this kind of absurdity. And imagine the problem for children in a blended family. It's horrific. And today we do well just to think of having people married. When they're counting married people, they don't worry about which marriage it is. They're just happy that they're even married, as opposed to those who are not. Political ethics seeks the end of society by means of the natural association of men, in other words, society. That's the next step up from the family. And we've discussed that at length. D, I can't overstate this one, we've done it many times, and that's the importance of double effect. If you're trying to understand any problem in ethics, go out there and grab your little quiver of double effect arrows, apply all 4 principles to it, make sure you got them right.
Would you say them again?
You want me to remember them? Okay, I think it's something like this. I had somebody from religious studies, a nun, come to me once and asked me to explain them to her. The act in itself must be good or neutral, right? It can't be intrinsically evil. There has to be the act itself cannot be an illicit means to a good end. You can't use an immoral means to a good end. There has to be a due proportion between the effects produced, so that you're not producing a lesser good for a greater evil. They've got to at least be equally balanced. And you can't take joy in the evil side effects.
And they have to flow with equal immediacy.
They have to flow with equal immediacy. The 2 effects flow with equal immediacy. That's where you're not using the evil means to get to the good end. That's another way of putting it. All right, we've got one more page before we get to that last page. And I'm not sure, after all we've been doing here, that I'm going to be able to take a whole class on that last page. That's an interesting question. But anyway, we'll finish up with page 53 tonight. We've already talked about, in case of capital punishment, what are we talking about? We're talking about removing an impediment to the common good, and this is the double effect. You're talking about complete removal from society. Well, the execution really does completely remove somebody, doesn't it? About as completely as you can. And you have the intended effect, which is the restoration of peace and order, and the unintended side effect, which is the death of man. And that's why you're not supposed to hold execution parties. You know, they used to do this. In the Old West, they said, we're going to have a hanging. Go get your hot dogs and hamburgers, and, you know, somebody will play the music. No, or think of the French, you know, when they were executing people with a guillotine. You know, Madame Defarge out there doing her knitting. Everybody coming to see a good guillotining. Everybody thought this was wonderful. You know what actually put an end to it? I think I mentioned it to you before. You know, it's like they thought the people were enjoying it or something, but they finally, or else they looked like such miserable wretches you didn't care that they got beheaded. But once they had a very beautiful young woman who expressed a great deal of negative anticipation. And it finally got through to the people watching that, gee, maybe this isn't simply good sport. And that's what brought about the end of it. And of course, what goes around comes around, because Robespierre, who was responsible for untold numbers of people being beheaded, himself finally fell prey to the guillotine. And it wasn't a good deal in his case, because he was rather elderly and had a bad case of arthritis, and they had to put him down flat before they could do it. And it wasn't very comfortable, coming or going. Okay, then finally, point F, we have the eternal law, which, as man understands it, is called the natural law. And we should always remember that natural law isn't something you can easily just dispense with, because notice it's two parts. You got the physical law and the moral law. And under the moral law, the civil and positive law. But nobody would claim, let's go out and violate the natural physical law. You know, I'm going to go over the falls without benefit of a barrel, and I should be just fine, because I don't believe in gravity. I think there should be exceptions to every rule. You know, situations. In my situation, gravity shouldn't apply. I'm a nice guy. I just want to go over the falls just to see what it looks like. So, you know, that's not going to work. Gravity will apply. The problem with moral laws, people can't see the effects of what they do that's wrong. But again, remember the difference between the a priori and the a posteriori. A posteriori is utilitarianism. That's where they get wrapped up only in the effects. All they're looking at is if it's good effects, it must be a good act. If it's bad effects, it's a bad act. Because they forget that the act itself has a nature. You can't make the deliberate taking of an innocent human life into a good act unless you're God. Can't make it a good act. So natural law requires that we pay attention to the nature of the act itself and realize that just because you think the effects are good, that doesn't make it a good act. You know that when you leap off the falls and land at the bottom hard, that's not a good result. But would it be a good act to have leapt off the top of the falls even if you survive? See? You've done something extremely risky, foolhardy, foolishly. You've risked your life for no reason at all. I always think of that case you remember some 20 years ago about that man that was reaching off the Three Sisters Island, or was it Goat Island? He was reaching for a quarter. He reached and he reached and he reached and he lost his balance. Now, what do you do when you get to God and he says, well, what did you do with your life? What did you spend your life on? Oh, well, I was trying to get a quarter. See, that's why we can't measure things simply by the results. So just as the natural physical law is an objective standard of law that applies to everybody universally and cannot be ignored without great damage to the person, to everything, so too the natural moral law cannot be ignored and ought not be, and we are required by our consciences in relation to our last end not to ignore it. And even if we can't see the negative consequences for society immediately, that doesn't make it legitimate to do it, you see. Even if we think the results are going to be wonderful, the natural law perspective says, wait a minute, you can't do that. And of course, because the natural law is objectively true and correct, in the long run, obeying natural law will produce better results, whether you can see it in the short term or not. But you've got all our social scientists out there trying to measure and see, well, what produces the better results? Can't go at it that way. You're just deceiving yourself. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we have actually come to the end of the course in ethics. If you look at page 54 of your notes, you'll find that what this is a brilliant chart that was actually constructed by Dr. Rayful Waters, which summarizes the entire course, and really we have already covered it. So it's something that you can go back and use to remind yourself of the various parts of the course and how they all fit together. That being the case, I thank you for your kind attention for this rather long span that we've been going through, some, I don't know how many, 40 classes? 43 classes, and we will now bring the course of ethics to an end. Thank you.
This set of philosophy lectures is produced and distributed by Olting Library Services, 2316 Delaware Avenue, PMB 325, Buffalo, New York, 14216. Please visit our webpage at www.aquinasphilosophy.com.